Hello everyone, welcome back. This coming Shabbos is a very auspicious day. It's the 10th day of Shvat, Yud Shvat, on the Hebrew calendar. And Yud Shvat is a very important day for Hasidim, for everybody. It's the Yortzeit, the anniversary of the passing of the previous Lubavitch Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, of blessed memory, and the beginning of 1 year later of the ascension of his son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, to be the successor and to be the current Lubavitcher Rebbe. So this would be 71 years of the Rebbe's leadership, or 70 years, depending on how you look at it. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was a very special person. He was the sixth in the direct line from the Alter Rebbe, from Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad movement. He was the son of the previous Rebbe before him, Rabbi Dovber, Shalom Dovber Schneerson, who we call the Rebbe Rashab, who was one of the leading rabbis in Russia in the 1800s. And he led a very interesting, although a very difficult life. Born in 1890 in the city of Lubavitch, which was a small town in White Russia, and he was sent by his father at a young age to travel around and to help people and to represent his father in various rabbinical conferences and to aid Jews in distress. So even before he was Rebbe, he was a very important person. He ran the Chabad Yeshiva. He was a director of the Chabad Yeshiva. He was the one who he left Chabad with his father and ended up moving the Chabad movement around Europe, finally to a suburb of Warsaw in the late 1930s, early 1940s. As Poland was being invaded by the Nazis, and he ended up in a town called Otwosk on the outskirts of Warsaw, which was a resort town in the woods because he suffered from multiple sclerosis later on in life, and he had a very harsh life, being imprisoned several times by the communist regime. And eventually, in 1940, he left Russia. He left Poland, and he came miraculously to the United States, New York. The story of how he got out of Poland with the aid, remarkably, of a Nazi officer is a story for the books. In fact, Rabbi David Eliezer is writing a book right now on the life of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And this story about his escape from Nazi Germany will be a prominent part of the story, and we all look forward to reading it when the book comes out, probably in the next 6 months or so, and find out all the details about it. He had a difficult life, a harsh life. He came to America one time in 1928, and he traveled around America at that time, talking about the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. He traveled around. He went to different cities. He went to New Haven and Chicago and St. Louis. And wherever he went, he was met with throngs of people who wanted to hear him, who wanted to talk with him, who wanted private audiences with him. He was very famous and very well known as the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And but he went back to Europe because he felt that that's where he was needed at that time, and that's where the center of Jewish life was in many respects, was in Russia. So he went back, and he had it very difficult, persecuted by the communist regime in the early 1930s during the severe Stalinist decrees, the doctor's plot and other things, in which rabbis especially were persecuted terribly, because the communist regime, of course, was an atheistic regime, and it came down harshly on religions of any kind. And he stood up as a hero, continuing his work in establishing Jewish schools and synagogues and mikvahs and Jewish life, and he was considered an enemy of the state. until finally, in 1940, he was able to come to America. Why did he come to America? Because he saw that the writing was on the wall in Europe, in Russia. It was during the Nazis were growing, and the communists were growing in the East, and there was really very little hope for Jews there. But he saw life in America, especially in New York, as having tremendous promise. And that's where he wanted to go, and that's where he felt he could do the most good. So, in 1940, at the age of 50 years old, he started off with a small movement in New York, in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, New York. Till eventually they purchased a house, a three-story house on Eastern Parkway in the Crown Heights section of New York, which at that time was a very prosperous, prominent area and neighborhood. They bought a house that had an elevator in it, very unusual because he was in a wheelchair. He couldn't climb the stairs. The synagogue was on the main floor, and his residence was on the second floor, and the library was on the second floor and the third floor as well. So the address of his new home, 770 Eastern Parkway, became quite well known. To this day, it's called just by 770, and everybody knows, you mentioned 770, you know that's Chabad World Headquarters. For 10 years, he lived in New York, and he developed his movement. He sent emissaries. Before the whole Shluchim movement came about with Chabad, he sent emissaries to different places. He sent Rabbi Hecht to Chicago, and he sent Rabbi Reichik to Los Angeles, and another Rabbi Hecht to New Haven, Connecticut. And he sent other rabbis to New York, to St. Louis, and to other places. And he started a movement of day school education, of encouraging children to go to day schools and for day schools to grow. But he was weak, and it was hard to hear him. He couldn't speak publicly very much. People would come and see him, but only very few people. To get an audience with the previous Rebbe was very difficult, and people would come and he would just literally whisper to them. They could hardly hear him. He was so weak. Until eventually in 1950, he passed away. And the movement was without a leader for 1 year. And I mentioned that the Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, took over in 1951. But actually, he was the Mali Makom, he was the successor of his father-in-law. Everyone knew it. And but he refused to accept the leadership formally until Yud Shvat of 1951. So the previous Rebbe passed away in, I think, January 27th of 1950. His son-in-law took over in 1951 formally. He went out to the synagogue, and he said a mimer of Hasidic philosophy, a discourse of Hasidic philosophy. And at that point, everybody knew that he became the Rebbe. What was different about the Rebbe about Rabbi Menachem Mendel, was that from the very beginning, unlike most other Hasidic Rebbes, the Rebbe said, you can't depend on me to do everything. You need to do it. You need to work hard yourself. For most other Rebbes, you would go to them for a blessing. If you were ill or you needed help or whatever it may be, for parnasa, for a livelihood, you would go to a Rebbe. A Rebbe would give you some cake, or you would give the Rebbe some money, and the Rebbe would give you a blessing. That's how it worked. You went to a Rebbe for blessing. I remember my grandfather telling me that when he was a young child growing up in Poland, his family would go travel several miles to another city to visit a particular Rebbe who lived there. That if they needed a blessing for something, they would give the Rebbe the money, which is called a pidyon. They would give him the pidyon, and they would ask what they wanted to ask, and the Rebbe would give them a blessing, and they went home. This Rebbe was different. This Rebbe said from the beginning, I am not going to give you a blessing unless you are prepared to do something about it yourself. This is a unique idea, a radical idea, that the Hasidim themselves needed to make that blessing work. They needed to make it work. If they weren't going to do anything about it, the Rebbe's blessings were not going to help. But so that was the attitude of the new Lubavitcher Rebbe. And this is a radical idea. So people started to come to him. They started to swarm around his table at his synagogue. And they wanted to hear the words of Torah from this man. How remarkable he was. He was young, but he was unbelievably remarkable, and people could see it all over. So the Rebbe became Rebbe formally in 1951, and the rest is history. He developed a movement that today numbers in the hundreds of thousands, or perhaps a million people all over the world, with emissaries all over the world. There is not a place that does not have Chabad, and the reach of the Rebbe is felt everywhere, from Wyoming to New York to Australia to South America to South Africa to Israel to Europe to Asia, everywhere, even in places that you would think Jews don't even live there. But Jews are not only living there, but there is even a Chabad center there in those places. It's a remarkable thing that's been done. So much so that the Chabad movement has created a movement which is unique in the Jewish world, has never been done before, and it's probably the most dynamic movement in Jewish life today. With all of it, and with all of the credit that is given to the Rebbe, when the Rebbe passed away, even before that, he was written up in the New York Times, in the magazine section, and so many other magazines and newspapers, and books are written about him. Only the last few years, 3 books were written about him in 1 year. One by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, Oliver Shalom, one by Joseph Telushkin, called the Rebbe, and a third by Rabbi Eliezer. So even just in 1 year. And that's after the Rebbe passed away. More Chabad houses have been started since the Rebbe passed away than in all the time that the Rebbe was alive. And during all that time, the Rebbe always insisted that his father-in-law, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, he was behind it all. He would refer to his father-in-law as Nasi Dareinu, the leader of our generation. The Rebbe, the Shver, he would call him the Rebbe, the father-in-law. He attributed all of his success and all of the work that he did to his father-in-law. He got all of the influence from his father-in-law, all of the dynamic presence of his father-in-law. He attributed it all to him. And he would go to his father-in-law's grave in Queens, which people go to these days a visit, where his father-in-law and the Rebbe are buried both next side by side. We call it the Ohel. So many people have been there. He would go very often to his father-in-law's grave, at least once or twice a month, sometimes more than that. And he would spend the whole day there fasting and praying on behalf of people, reading their requests to him. And it was a very common, didn't matter if it was the summertime or the wintertime, whether it was very hot or very cold. He would go there and he would pray for hours and hours on end. And each year, on Yud Shvat, the Rebbe would make a major Farbrengen, a major gathering. And dignitaries from all over the world would come and share a few words with him at this Farbrengen at 770, which was attended by literally thousands of people. People would come in from all over the world just to attend the Farbrengen. And at the Farbrengen, he would talk about his father-in-law and the work of his father-in-law and the ideals that his father-in-law stood for. And these Farbrengens became quite well known. Yud Shvat was one of the major Farbrengens of the year. It's significant to me because my birthday was 3 days before the Rebbe passed away, before Rebbe Yosef Yitzchak passed away. I was born on the 7th of Shvat of Tavshin Yud of 5,710, and which is 1950, and he passed away 3 days later. I didn't know him. Of course, I was a baby. I was only 3 days old when he passed away. But nevertheless, the day is significant for me as well for that reason. So this is based on a Verbringen that the Rebbe spoke, our current Rebbe, Rabbi Moshe Leider, spoke on Yud Shvat in the year 1986. By the way, this Shabbos is Yud Shvat, so there'll be Verbringens all over. We are going to be making in San Diego a Verbringen Saturday night on Zoom, and we'd be happy to send you out the link so that you can listen in on the Verbringen. Various rabbis will be speaking, and it should be quite interesting. So the Rebbe starts off by saying every action of intelligent people has a reason and a purpose. Everything we do, if we're intelligent, regular, normal people, has a reason for it. Why is it that people come together for a common action? There must be a unifying cause and a purpose for it. Sometimes we must seek a reason why people come together, and sometimes the reason is quite clear to us and obvious to us. Each of those gatherings, I'm sure if there was a Verbringen today, I'm sure probably at the Verbringen on Saturday night that we have on Zoom, many of the rabbis will probably talk about the pandemic. It's one of the issues. It's called in Yonah Diyoma. It's one of the issues that's happening today that needs to be spoken about. In fact, very often at the Verbringen, the Rebbe used to speak about issues that were happening at this time, whether it was the Gulf War or the Six-Day War in Israel, many events that were taking place in Israel, or God forbid a terrorist attack, or a presidential election, or different other issues that were coming up in the world. He says, so sometimes it's quite obvious why we get together, and sometimes the reason is clear, which is, of course, the reason for everybody getting together at this particular Verbringen that he spoke about, which is the Yortzeit of the previous Rebbe. The Rebbe mentions that a Yortzeit is a Yiddish word, which means a year's time. It's an anniversary of the passing of someone. So he says a Yortzeit is a broad subject. Why do we gather together on a Yortzeit after so many years since the previous Rebbe had passed away? In fact, this Verbringen was said on 1986, which is about 36 years after the Rebbe passed away. He says here too we should see a clear directive, for we speak of one who sacrifices life to spread Torah. Just the fact that the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, sacrificed his life, was incarcerated in very harsh circumstances, but he devoted his life completely. His life would have been much easier. In 1928, when he came to America, people pleaded with him to stay in America. Don't go back there. It's a very difficult time. Many rabbis would come to America to do fundraising for their yeshivas, their institutions in Europe, and many of them saw the writing on the wall, and they stayed in America. Some of them went back to Europe, and some of them were killed. It brings to mind the famous Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman Abranovich of the famous yeshiva of Branovich, one of the great leading rabbis of the time, who came to America also around that time, and who went back to Europe and was murdered cruelly by the Nazis in his own yeshiva. But many of them did that. Many of them went back and they were killed. He said, so it is that the previous Rebbe devoted himself completely to spreading Torah. This was his driving force in life for himself, and this was his central theme, which he demanded of others around him. Completely. They say of the previous Rebbe that before he left Russia, he gathered a number of his close Hasidim around him, and he told them that he wanted to know if they are prepared to sacrifice their life for Judaism. These were I think there were 9 of them, leading Chabad rabbis who were called into his office. He wanted to know if they are willing to sacrifice their very life for Judaism, for his mission that he's going to send them on. And they agreed, and he sent them different places, and some of them died. Some of them were exiled to Siberian prison camps. But they never left their mission in life, and their mission was that they were shluchim of the previous Rebbe. They were sent out on a mission, on various missions, wherever it was, throughout Europe, throughout Russia, and they never lost that mission. Can you imagine how the previous Rebbe must have felt, taking 9 middle-aged men with wives and families and sending them possibly to their death by going on as an emissary of him to spread Judaism? What it must have taken for him to have done something like that. But he realized that it was a question of life and death for the Jews of Europe. This was his driving force in life for himself, and this was the essential theme which he demanded of others around him. It's therefore understandable that his life and accomplishments are remembered each year by gathering together on his yahrzeit and by studying his Torah teachings. We speak especially of the Torah discourses, which he prepared before his passing. It seems that the Rebbe knew that he was going to die soon. He was sick, he was weak, and he recognized the fact that his time was very soon up. So he prepared several Hasidic discourses, which were, some of them were said before he died, and some of them were said after he died, in preparation for his death. The first mimer, dated the 10th of Shvat. At the beginning and end of the mimer, we find a subject which gives us purpose of this yearly gathering, which we must emphasize. This mimer is commonly called Basi Lagani. Basi Lagani means, and I'm looking it up. I am looking it up because I want to give you an idea. Let's see, Basi, and you can look it up on your computer as well. Here it is, Basi Lagani. First said in 1950. First said in 1950. And how does it start? Chapter 1 starts. Basi Lagani Achosi Kala. It's from the Song of Songs, from Shir Hashirim. And it starts, I have come to my garden, my sister, my bride. Basi Lagani Achosi Kala. I come to my garden, referring to the world, my sister, my bride. So, what does this mean? It means, what is the garden? The garden refers to the world, or the Garden of Eden. That originally, the Shekhinah, God's divine presence, came into the world when the world was created. And that's why the Garden of Eden was such a beautiful, majestic place where Adam and Eve were able to walk through the garden and enjoy all of the bounty of the garden. But after the sins of 7 generations had caused the divine presence to withdraw, 7 generations of people from Noah on through Abraham, and they caused the Shekhinah, one after the other, to depart from the world. And so the Shekhinah left. But then, with Abraham, the Shekhinah came back to the world. Abraham, and then Yitzchak, it came back more and more and more until Moshe, the 7th of the Tzaddikim, came back into the world and returned the Shekhinah back into the world. So the idea is that godliness left the world, and then it came back into the world with the tzaddikim, who brought holiness and goodness to the world. And this is the mimer that we learn on Yud Shvat. I came to my garden, I came to my bridal chamber. The Jewish people are compared to a bride. God is compared to the groom, where my essence was originally revealed. At the beginning of creation, the essence of the Shekhinah, of God's divine presence, was apparent in the lowly world. So the mimer tells us that specifically the world is called my garden, for God was satisfied with it at the start. And even though there were negative causes of change in the world, still a solution was provided which pushed away the bad aspects and made the world pleasurable for God. This shows us that when we gather, our purpose is to do what we can to make the world again pleasurable for God, to continue God's presence in the world, to make the world into a dira b'tachtainim, a dwelling place where God can dwell in the physical world, where God is comfortable in the physical world. And this was the goal, the dream of the previous Rebbe, and it was continued with his son-in-law, the present Rebbe, to make the world into a holy place. And they devoted every aspect of their being to that goal, so that creation itself needs to be, in a way, to have a purpose. And that purpose, it's not just that we were born in this world to walk around and to go swimming and have a good time, but we were born into this world to make the world into a godly place, to make it into a garden where God can dwell. And we know that there are 7 general rules, the 7 Noachad laws, with all their details, which all nations of the world must accept. So this idea of making the world into a godly place is not just a mitzvah for Jews, but it's a mitzvah for everybody. By doing commandments, whether 613 commandments for Jews or 7 commandments for non-Jews, the purpose is to make the world into a godly place and to prepare it for the coming of Mashiach. So he says there's another thought which the Maimar discusses. Before Matan Torah, before the Torah was given, at the time of creation, before the sin, the spirit of godliness filled the world. Then later on, in the days of Moshe, at the Torah, at Mount Sinai, the voice of God reverberated all over, saying, "Ani Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me." So the word of God reached all 4 corners of the earth, so much so that even the animals were quiet to hear the words of God. This, however, came after the time that the Shekhinah had gone away from the world and was now returning back. But it did come back to the lower worlds through the Mishkan, through the tabernacle, the portable temple in the desert, where the Shekhinah would dwell forever upon it. And later, after the Torah was given, the Torah is still new, for at every moment the Torah is given again as new. Therefore, it must be new in our eyes. Clearly, each person can fulfill his mission. What was the previous Rebbe's purpose? What was his mission statement? And what was the mission statement and purpose of our Rebbe, of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson? What drove them? What kept them going? What did they see as their purpose in this world? They saw their purpose in this world was to disseminate Torah and mitzvahs of the commandments of the Torah, and to make the world into a godly place by bringing other Jewish people in and getting them involved in Jewish life as well. So this was their purpose, why they were brought into the world. And in fact, that becomes the purpose for all of us. I was reading a story recently in a magazine about the chief Chabad rabbi of the Netherlands, Rabbi Vorst. So Rabbi Vorst was on the board of the local Jewish day school in his city, and it came up one time that they had a rule in their day school. The rule was they only accepted Jewish kids in the day school, kids who were halachically Jewish. So this rule went along fine until one time, one of the very prominent members of the community, who was married to a non-Jew, came to the school and said, "We want to enroll our son in the high school here." And the school was perplexed. What should we do? We have a rule that we do not accept children who are not halachically Jewish into the school. On the other hand, this fellow was a very wealthy man, a major benefactor to the community, to the Jewish community in their city. How could they turn him away? So they turned to Rabbi Vorst and they asked him his opinion. What should they do? He stood his ground and he said, we should not accept him in the school. It's our policy and we should not accept him. It's a Jewish school and it's for Jewish kids. The parents, needless to say, were furious. And they left, and I don't know what happened as far as their support of Jewish life in the Netherlands, but I can't imagine it was so active after that. Rabbi Vorst makes a side note. He says, many years later, this young man who was going to be in the high school ended up going through an Orthodox conversion. Yes, an Orthodox conversion. And he ended up becoming observant himself. And he ended up marrying and having children. And I think they moved to Israel. And at the end, it all turned out well. What motivated him to do all that? He realized that the values of the school were values. They were serious. The school meant business. And indeed, Judaism believes in values. Judaism has standards, and these standards are important standards that we live by. Without these standards, we will assimilate. We will not continue. We will not survive as Jews. If we lower our standards, then that could be it for us. So we need to be strong in our standards and not budge. And in fact, the previous Rebbe and the Rebbe himself also believed in that. They believed in standards. And to make sure that we stick by those standards. He says the previous Rebbe showed this by his own example and was practiced by his followers who were ready to advance against all objects, no matter what was thrown their way. Actually, the objects are only the making of the sly one, he says, of the Satan, who endeavors to stop our divine service. So the Satan, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, comes our way to stop us in our tracks and to make all kinds of obstacles in our tracks to prevent us from doing the right thing. And we see this all the time throughout life. One of the issues that came up in the 1970s was when the State of Israel was formed. So Ben Gurion, the Prime Minister, went around to all major rabbis and asked their opinion about the situation of religion in Israeli life. And they all agreed, they were all Orthodox rabbis, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and the Rebbe was one of them as well. And they all agreed that there should be a standard for Jewish life in Israel. There should be a standard. Now this was at a time that the Reform movement, the Conservative movement were coming along, and lowering standards and making all kinds of different standards, saying it's okay to drive on Shabbos and you don't have to eat kosher anymore and things like that. So Ben Gurion, who himself was not a religious man by any stretch of the imagination, he went to them and he asked them what they think. And they said there should be an establishment of standards by which all Jews abide by those standards. And what were those standards? The standard was, in one word, halacha, Jewish law. Jewish law. And he realized that you need standards. Just like in every country, there are laws. And the legislature can change the laws, but very carefully. But if the legislature decides to change a law, it's sent to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court itself decides if it is in keeping with the Constitution or not. If it's not, they will even throw out a law that the legislature itself makes. Because the Constitution is our Bible in America anyways. And there are standards by which we live. And someone cannot come to this country and live in one way and follow in another way and be an American citizen. You can't do that. So there are standards and there are rules. Similarly, Ben Gurion realized that in order for the Jewish people to survive, they need to have standards. One of the standards was that Jewishness itself should be defined by halacha, by Jewish law. And halacha says that a person is Jewish if they were born of a Jewish mother or if they converted according to the rules of halacha. We call this giyur kahalacha, conversion according to halacha. And this standard continued until, I believe, 1972, at which time, under tremendous pressure from the liberal movements, especially in America, the Knesset, the Parliament of Israel, changed the rule to say instead of that it should be conversion according to halacha, it said just conversion. And it did not say what the conversion should be. The conversion can be any kind of conversion. Anybody can do a conversion. There could be Reform conversions, and conservative conversions, and Orthodox conversions. And everyone should accept every type of conversion. And this became a tremendous, tremendous confusion in the world. What determines what a Jew is? Who determines what a Jew is? If someone was converted by a Reform rabbi without circumcision, without mikveh, without a commitment to follow the Torah and its laws, are they considered still a Jew or not? According to the Reform, yes. According to the conservative, no, not exactly. According to the Orthodox, definitely not. And they wanted the different standards to apply to everybody. And this became what's called a balagan, a total confusing mess. And the Rebbe spoke out very strongly about it, that we should not compromise our standards, compromise our values. What is it that makes us a Jew? What makes us an American? Being an American, you need to be in the country for a certain period of time, 3 to 5 years. You need to learn about the rules and the laws of the country. You need to know about the U.S. Constitution. You need to speak the language of America. You need to have a working knowledge of English. And then you need to take an oath that you will abide by the laws of the United States. If you are not prepared to do any of those, or even not to do one of those, let's say, for example, you would say, okay, I pledge I'll follow the laws of the country, but there are some laws that I don't agree with, and those laws I'm not going to keep. What would America do? What would they say? They'd say, I'm sorry, find another country to go to. You can't pick and choose. You can't say, I'll do this law, but not that law. You need to do, it's an all or nothing affair when it comes to becoming an American citizen. Similarly, in Judaism, Ben Gurion himself realized that in order to be a Jew, there needs to be standards that everybody accepts. Not just one group or the other group, but everybody accepts those standards. And those standards must be something that everyone agrees with. And what is that? Halacha. Jewish law, as defined by the Torah and the sages of Israel. People need to follow one set of rules. Now, the liberal movements are very upset about this. I once had a conversation with a very old friend of mine from Toronto, and we discussed it. He was very much opposed to the place of the Orthodox rabbinate in Jewish life in Israel, and he said there should be plurality. They call it pluralism. Everyone's views should be accepted. So I asked him, "You're a conservative rabbi. Would you accept a conversion from a Reform rabbi without a bris, without mikveh? Would you accept that?" He said, "No." I said, "Would you marry somebody from your congregation to someone who had a conversion like that? Would you marry them?" "No." Why not? Because they don't abide by the conservative standard. Well, that means that if you're converted Reform, so the Reform accept you, but the conservatives don't accept you, and the Orthodox don't accept you. If you're conservative, the Reform will accept you, the conservative will accept you, but the Orthodox will not accept you. What a mess. If you are converted Orthodox, everybody will accept you. Everyone will accept you. So there has to be standards by which we all live. And these standards were strong standards that were abided by from days of old. In Europe and Asia, in Russia, many of the governments in those places tried very much to erode the standards of Jewish life by asking the rabbis to compromise and not to follow the strict letter of halacha so carefully and so strictly. And many of them capitulated. Many of them gave up. And many of them came to America, and they, instead of abiding by halacha in America, they became weaker. And their standards of kosher, of Shabbos, of synagogues became much weaker as a result of it. And what happened? Their people intermarried, and Jewish life went on a steep decline. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe saw this, and he was very concerned about it. And his son-in-law, the Rebbe, also spoke out about it, that we need the strong standards of Jewish life. When the previous Rebbe came to these shores in 1950, he said the words, America is not different. That just as you need to be a Jew, observant Jew in Europe, you need to be an observant Jew in America also. In America, you also need to keep kosher and keep Shabbos and put on tefillin every day. And go to Jewish schools and all of these things. Wear yarmulke, wear tzitzis. In America, you need to do it just as you needed to do it in Europe. And he stood by that. And he established schools with high standards that the children were taught by teachers who themselves were observant Jews. Well, at the time, in the early 1950s, many of the Jewish day schools that were being started at that time did not have enough teachers to teach the children. So they employed teachers who were not themselves Torah observant Jews. Because they couldn't find anybody to teach them, they figured, well, it's not so terrible. So we get somebody who's not religious. He'll teach them Hebrew. He'll teach them some Jewish history. He'll teach them about the holidays. It's better than nothing. The Rebbe, both the previous Rebbe and our Rebbe, fought strongly against it. He said that Jewish schools need to be established al taharat hakodesh, on the purity, the holy purity of Jewish law and Jewish tradition. And he insisted that the children be taught exactly, traditionally, as they were before, and without compromising one iota, not one iota. And there was a lot of antagonism towards it. You can imagine many of the Jewish leaders are very much opposed to it. Better to compromise than have nothing. In fact, an analogy was brought. One of the more liberal rabbis went to one of the Orthodox rabbis and said, "Rabbi, if there's a fire going on, a fire, and the whole city's on fire, and the only water you have is dirty water, it's not pure water, wouldn't you use it to put out the fire? Okay, it's not pure water, but at least it's water, pure water, dirty water, put it out." The Rebbe answered him saying, "That's true, but what happens if the water that you're using is not water at all, but it's kerosene or gasoline? It looks like water, but it's not. It'll end up making the fire worse, much worse." And this was indeed what happened throughout so much of Jewish life, especially in America, where kerosene was used to put out the fires, and it turned out to make it even worse than ever. That our children grew up not understanding the beauty and the preciousness of Judaism, but rather they were shown that Judaism is a religion of compromise, and unfortunately it led them to intermarry, to assimilate, and the education that people were hoping to give to their children backfired on them. So the Chabad movement especially has always been known to be a movement of no compromise. And sometimes we got ourselves in trouble for that. We have lost major donors because of that. But nevertheless, we stand by our ground, and we realize that we cannot move from the true path. And indeed, this has caused us to be respected around the world, and we are able to follow Judaism and to teach Judaism in a way that is a proper Jewish way to teach them. And while many people have opposed that and have argued against it, but nevertheless we stuck to our guns. So at this Farbrengen that the Rebbe spoke about, he emphasized the fact that the previous Rebbe believed in a Judaism without compromise, a Torah true Judaism. Not everybody is going to be 100% religious. Not everybody is going to keep every mitzvah. But the mitzvah you're going to keep, you're going to do properly. You're going to keep Shabbat. If you're going to keep one mitzvah, and that mitzvah is Shabbos, it's going to be 100% Shabbos. If you're going to do 1 hour of Shabbos a day, the only thing you can keep is 1 hour of Shabbos. That 1 hour will be 100% Torah, true Judaism, 1 hour. You won't answer the phone during that hour. You won't watch TV. You'll spend that hour with your family. You'll have a Shabbos meal perhaps during that 1 hour. But you will not light a fire. You won't smoke a cigarette. You won't do any of these things. You will follow Shabbos exactly for that 1 hour. And next week it'll be 2 hours, and then 3 hours, and then 4 hours. Gradually. Each mitzvah at a time in the proper way, in the right way, without compromise, in a way that the Torah instructs us to do. And if we don't know what that is, contact our local Orthodox rabbi, our Chabad rabbi, if you will. And they will direct us into how exactly to do this. And the Maimer, getting back to the Maimer of Basi Lagani, we'll just finish on this. The Maimer emphasizes the idea that we need, that God wants this world to be a holy place, a garden. But we know one thing, that in a garden, it takes work. You need to plow, you need to prune, you need to water that garden and take good care of it. If you don't, that garden will turn into a bed of weeds. And when people come to me and they say, well, I don't want to give anything to my children now, they're young. When they get older, they'll decide what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. I'd say I strongly disagree with that. Because if you don't plant the right seeds right now with your children, you will end up with a bed of weeds. And they will not have the background that is necessary that they need so badly. So that should be a lesson for all of us, to make sure that our children get a good Torah education, that the mitzvahs we do should be without compromise. And I want to bless you all with long life and happiness and health. And may we all join together with the coming of Mashiach. We'll see you Saturday night at the Farbrengen.
Amen.